Hello and welcome to part 3 of the NodeJS course here at Hack Your Future. We're going to start off today by looking at how we can use other APIs. So we've talked about how when you have a classical server architecture where we have a client that is talking to a server. So we have the client who is sending a request to the server. The server gets this request, does some processing, possibly talks to a database to get some data, and then sends back a response to the client, which could be, for example, an HTML or something like that, or JavaScript or JSON. And then the JavaScript in the client or the browser itself renders this to the user so that they can make use of it. Now, this architecture is, I think, the simplest possible architecture for a client-server model. But in reality, things are, of course, a bit more complicated. Uh, the problem that you have with this architecture is that when a request goes to the server, it is not always possible, or maybe it's not always economical, to have all the possible functionality sitting on this one server. What in reality happens is that this server needs to talk to other servers and to other databases to gather the information required to provide the response. So the way this server talks to other servers on the internet is not very different from the way the client talks to this server. It uses the same HTTP protocol and the same APIs that or similar APIs that we have when the client is talking to the server. Now in this architecture, kind of our server now becomes a client for a different server which has some information. This would look something like this. So this is our server now. Imagine that we have received a request from a client and now we need to process that request, but in order to do that we need some extra information or some extra processing that we do not have. What the server would then do, it would send a request over the internet to some other web server, which could be under our control or could be under someone else's control, like Google or something like that. This server needs to have an API so that we can talk to it. But if we send a request to this server, it can use its own internal resources like a database and its internal logic to get the data that we need, and it will send us back a response. And this is not limited to only one other server. In reality, usually one web server would talk probably to 5, 10, or even more other web servers in order to gather all the data that it needs so that it can send back the response to the client. Now, what is our job as developers is, so when we are writing the server code using Node, we need to make sure that we can handle the request of the users, and sometimes during that handling of a request from a user, we would need to call other APIs from other web servers in order to get some data that we need. Now, why do we need this other data? Well, it depends on the situation, but you can imagine that there is some, for example, the easiest one is that there is some data that we do not have in a database and someone else has, and they have made it available via an API. That's one scenario. Another scenario is, for example, if there is some very complicated functionality that we do not provide, but someone else provides through an API, then it does not make a lot of sense for us as developers to rebuild this entire functionality uh, when we can just use this API that's available. And finally, the last reason is that as we are building more and more complicated server, our code becomes so complicated that it's hard uh, to manage. And in that case, when you have that big of an application, it actually makes sense to split up your server into multiple servers and have them talk to each other through HTTP. This way, they're a bit separated from each other so that different teams can work on the code behind the different servers. Now, I don't want to go too many into details over why it is useful to do that. You can read more in the README about that. Just one quick note, the last reason for using it is also known as microservices. And this is now a very trendy thing. We're not going to teach microservices here, that's way out of scope, but it's good to know that this thing exists. And so in a nutshell, microservices is about building websites where the application is not just sitting on one server, but is actually split around a lot of different servers, and they are talking to each other using HTTP. Well, that's enough for that. What I want to do now is prepare you so that you can use APIs in your server code. Now, let's say you're building an app. That's great, right? And now you need in your app to add some functionality which you know that someone else is providing as an API. Here are some examples what kind of functionality there is out there. There is many more. But for example, if you want to authenticate users to your app, there are plenty of APIs and protocols out there for that. There are a lot of APIs around geolocation, checking address, and so forth. There are also APIs for sending emails. If you need to do anything with payments or credit cards or invoicing or things like that, there are a lot of APIs for payment processing, for example, and so forth. Now, if you, for example, need to use an API that checks an address, then what you need to do is you need to, first of all, find the right API. So you need to check what does the API really provide, and you need to check if that is really what you want in your application. To do this, you would need to read the documentation. So you find the API and then you start reading the documentation and try to figure out if it fits the requirements that you want. While you're reading, you need to jot down or write down what kind of endpoints there are, how is the authentication done, and so forth. And after you have a good idea of how the API is structured, then you can try one very basic example, which is usually part of the documentation. There should be the most basic example that you can find. You can try it out in Postman and see if it works. After you get the basic one working, then you try the more complicated ones until you have good confidence that you now know how the API works. And then finally, the last step in this process is actually implementing the API calls. And this is very important. So always read first the documentation and try the basic examples and make sure that things work. Because when you start coding and then something does not work, if you have not read the documentation, if you don't have an example that works, then you're gonna be stuck because something will not work and you will have no idea if there is something wrong in the code, if there is something wrong with the request, if there is something wrong with the authentication, or all kinds of other things that can go wrong. So it's always best to first try out the examples if they work with Postman before you start writing code to do these API requests. Now this is a lot of theory, I know, but we are gonna do a lot of exercise today. So I will just give you a demo of this one API real quick so that you understand why we would like to use an API. So we have here postcode.nl. This is basically an API which lets you search for a given postcode and then returns you all the possible addresses that match this postcode. Now this is very useful when you're building almost any kind of website where there are some location-based services. For example, if you want to send a mail or if you want to send a technician over, like all kinds of industries are connected to a physical location. So you would need this in a lot of different applications, and you don't want to build this from scratch because it's quite complicated to have all the different postcodes in the Netherlands and map them to each other, to addresses. So what this API does is, if I search for a postcode, for example 118 GV, then it gives me this list of addresses here that the user can then select. Now, this is a demo of the API. This is not the actual API. This is just a demo of how you could use the API. Okay, the actual API is documented here. So if I go back to the documentation, you will see here how you can call this API. So for example, if you want to get an address by a postcode, so this is now how a documentation looks like. There are no really standards around this, so you need to figure out. Every website is a story for itself, but you can search for a docs link somewhere and eventually you will end up on a page like this. Somewhere there should be a list of all the different types of requests that you can do. I think this is that list. And so for example, one of the options here says address by postcode. If I open that, there is some description here. It says, for example, get an address based on its unique combination of postcode, house number, and house number addition. And then it gives you some details. So for example, it says that the REST API requires the GET request. So this already tells you that the HTTP method should be GET. Then you look for the URL next. So this is the URL. And usually when there are parameters in the URL, then they would be marked like in some special way, like either italic or with a semicolon, or in some other way. Here they are marked with curly brackets. And this basically is a parameter. So this is the parameter that we need to pass to this API. And this is a very good API because here directly there is a example request. So for example, it has this is the HTTP method, this is the path, this is the host, there is some authorization in here as well, and it also shows you what you can expect as a response here. And the response is just some JSON which tells you the street and the house number, for example, for this request. Now what you need to do is to try out this example in Postman and then see if you can reproduce and get the same response or a similar response before you actually start writing any code. Now we're not gonna jump into this concrete API. This will just to give you an idea of how to read the documentation and what kind of information you need to look for. Again, look for what type of request you need to send, what is the host name, what is the path, how is the authorization done. So there will be more description about that and how the response looks like. Okay, just I think we can skip Stripe because it's a bit more complicated. Stripe is a payment processing API, but basically I have here open the documentation for Stripe, and you can see all the different possible operations that you can do. Here on the right you have the different HTTP methods and the different URLs that you need to use in order to make use of this API. So if you open one, again, you have the example here at the top and you have a sample response. So this is how you need to read through all of this to be able to use this API in your project. Now, Stripe is very complicated API. For our project, we're going to use something much simpler. And that API is called Random User API. Let's try this one. I think this is good. So this actually already works in the browser, but we're gonna what we're gonna do is we're gonna use Postman. So let me add, and we can do this together. So what I would do was add a new request, get random user, Now throw in the URL in here. So random user me API. The request needs to be get. And then if you send a request, it gives you back some result. Now I think you're going to use this API in the homework, so I'm going to leave it at this for now. And let me see if I can get to the documentation here. Yeah, so if you go to this website, there is some documentation here. And here you can read more about how to use this API, for example. And there are already examples here with code and all kinds of things in here. And this is the sample JSON. So we did the same with Postman, and then we have the result, which looks kind of the result that we have here. And so we are happy with this. We have a request in Postman that works. Then when we're writing the code, we can always come back to this request to Postman to see if the error that we have is somewhere in the code or if it's something to do with the request or the response. I think that's enough talking. Let's try and write an API call. So let's try to call this API and log this response to the console with Node. So I'm gonna open up a new folder. Okay, I'm here. I'm gonna create a new folder. So consume API. Now you can do this with me if you want. Actually, I would recommend to do this with me together. So I've created a new folder. Now we're gonna switch into that folder. Consume API. Now every time when we start a new Node project, guys, we always start with npm init. This sets up a nice project for us. There is the package.json. I'm gonna create now index.js. We can call it whatever we want. Now we have several options of how to consume APIs. I think what should we use? Okay, let's use Axios actually. I think you've used Axios also in the past, and Axios is also available for Node. All we need to do is install it. So npm install Axios, and while that is installing, I'm gonna Google it here. Okay, so this is the Axios homepage on npm. It says promise-based HTTP client for Node.js. This is how you can install it. And this is how you can use it. So I'm just gonna grab the code from here and then put this in our file. There we are. Okay, so it is installed. There are no errors. Now require Axios, that is to import the module so that we can use the module in here. Then we say get, and this is the URL here, and then we get the response. Otherwise we get an error. I just want to log the response, so I just need a URL, which is randomuser.me/API. Let's copy that, put it in here as a URL, and already this should be working. So notice I don't have Express in here. We are not writing a server or anything like that. We just are writing a very simple script that calls this API and logs the response to the console. That's all we want to do. So now if we try to run node index.js, I expect this to write a full set of JSON here. Whoa, that was a lot of JSON. The reason why we get such a big JSON is because we are logging the entire response, and I guess we only want to have the body of it. So probably we should have logged the body. Let me check real quick if we have in here body. Okay, so it's dot data dot results actually. So if you look at here, all the data is in a field called results. And with Axios, to get the body of the response, it's actually not called body, but it's called data for some reason. So response to data gives you the body, and then from the body, we're going to get the results, which is the thing that we actually want. So let's try and run that again, and hopefully we get a better output now. Yeah, now this looks much better. So now this looks very similar to what we got in Postman. So we have the data, we have an email, some login, blah blah blah, some picture, a lot of different information here. Yeah. So it's very similar to what we got in Postman. If we make a mistake somewhere, then we expect an error to show up. So let me make a deliberate error here. Oh, yeah. So now this is the error. We need to make sure to parse the error and see what is the status, for example. Maybe I should log that. Response.status. Let's see again. 404. Yeah, now we get 404. Yeah, so this is what we need to do with Axios. So the first verb here is the HTTP method. So this corresponds to the get HTTP method. And this part here is the URL. Then in the response, what we need to do is always get the response.data. And if we want to do something with the error, then we need to get the status or maybe the error message that came back from the server. I hope this is clear and that it's working for everyone. If not, you can ask questions during the Q&A or drop them in Slack. But it's a basic example that I expect to be working for everyone. And let me get it back working again. Let me run it again. Yeah, it still works. So this is the code that's working now. Okay, so that's one basic example. I basically copied it from here actually. That's really good. Now, let's see. Let me check the lesson plan, what we have planned. So consuming APIs, we did the example with get random user. And now we have a nice exercise for everyone. So the exercise here is, I'm gonna type the exercise. So, and that's the wrong one. Here, this is one. This is what you need to do. So, create a new Express server. When a request comes in, request comes in, yeah. Get the image from this API. and redirect the user to it. Yeah, so this is the first exercise. Random Fox is an API which gives back a link to an image. We can test that real quick with Postman. So if I drop this in here, Postman is very useful. So it gives you the body of the response. So you see here, there is a link to an image, and I can follow that link. That's not what I expected to happen there. Let me copy it and open it in the browser. So this is the image. It's just a random fox. No cats or dogs because I don't want to polarize people, so I'm gonna go with foxes here. But basically the goal is to send a request to this API, get this image URL, and then redirect to it. Okay, where did the exercise go? Yeah, there it is. So go ahead and try to do it on your own, and then we're gonna do it together. I hope you're done. If not, you can always pause the video, guys. Okay, let's do this together. So every time when we start writing a new piece of code with Node, what we need to do, make a new folder. So exercise 1, there it is, new folder. Let's go to it. I'm gonna navigate to that folder. There we are. Now, as always, npm init -- yes. I'm gonna throw this guy in there as well, so that everything is in one place. Now, we said we're gonna use Express, so we need to install Express. And while that is installing, I'm just gonna go and grab the Express starter pack from the npm website. There it is. Notice I'm very lazy because I just copy paste code. Whenever I need to start a new project with Express, I just copy this code from here and then start from that instead of typing it from scratch. Okay, so we have, or we can call it server maybe, server.js. Okay, then we have this code. Now it's always good to see if this is working, because if this is not working, then something is wrong. Just a sanity check. Okay, this should have been started now. If I go quickly to localhost 3000, I should see a hello world. Okay, so Express is up and running. That's all very good. Now let's try and call an API. Okay, I'm gonna stop the server. Okay, so we said to use the API, we're gonna use Axios. Now let's see, we need to install that as well. And I'm gonna grab again the code here. Let me put this side by side. Get rid of that guy. Okay. So we need the require code. I'm gonna throw that at the top here. Then the goal of the exercise was when a request comes in, we get the image from the API. This is the API, and then redirect to it. Okay, we're gonna do it step by step. So what we're gonna do first is we're gonna get the data from the API and log it to the console. Okay, just to make sure that that part works before we try the redirect part. So now how to call the API? It's axios.get and then the URL, and I'm gonna drop this one here. So instead of random user, we're gonna call random fox. Then we're gonna call then. Then we have the response. And then we say console.log uh, response.data. All right, that's good. Let's not forget about the error. Now, when an error comes in, we're just going to log it to the console. We cannot do anything about this error. It's outside of our hands. We're just going to log it and move on. So let's say error dot, again, the status. Okay. Now, if I run this, oops, wrong command, node server. Now expect the server to be running. Now if I send a request from the browser, then I expect to see the response to be logged. So let me try that. Send a new request, nothing has changed here. But in Node, yeah, here is the data that's coming from random fox. Oh, that's not so hard, right? Is it? Okay, now what we need to do is get this image guy and somehow redirect to it. So it's response.data.image. Now, how can you redirect to something? Does anybody know? Now, we have not done this before. What you can, if you don't know how to do something, then you always can Google for it or check the documentation at Express. But I happen to know that there is a method called redirect, and that method uh, accepts a URL, which is what we actually have here. And that's all that we need to do. So response.redirect, and this is the URL. To make that more clear, maybe I can put it in a variable, image URL. And then we want to redirect to that URL. Now, I don't need this hello world anymore, but I do need to do something when there is an error. And in that case, I'm just going to send a 500, for example. So to send 500, you can say status is 500. And then just say, yeah, there is again nothing we can do here with this error because it's not our server, it's just some other server, and we cannot handle it in any meaningful way. All we can do is log it and say to the user, yeah, something went wrong. There is nothing I can do about it right now. Sorry. That's all. That's all we can do with this error because we cannot really recover from this error. Okay. So let's try if this works. I'm gonna start again my server, and let's see if I go 3000. Bam! It works. That's unexpected. Things never work the first time, but somehow they seem to be working now. And that is our beautiful Arctic fox here on the snow. So that was not too hard, I think. Let's check the code again. Let me close this. So what we have here, we have a simple Express app. Inside one of the request handlers, what we do is we call an API, and then based on that, the response of that API, we use that when we send the response to our client, or in our case, our response was just a redirect. Okay. So that's the first exercise, but that's not all. There are more exercises. What I want to do next is actually, instead of redirecting, which is nice and all, but then the user is gone. What I would like to do is have this image put inside some HTML. I'm going to show you how I would like this to work real quick. Okay, let me quickly stop the server here. Node. Okay, I paused there for a second to get organized, but now I think I have everything running. So here is the end goal of this exercise. So we have a server running at port 3000, and when we open it, we get this nice image of a fox. And next to it, we have a button which says next, which when I click the button, it will load a new image here. So when I click next, a new image here is loaded. And this image is coming from the Fox API or the random Fox API. So that is the next exercise for you. I wrote it down here. Can you go away, please? Okay. So in this second part, you can copy the code from the first one. And what you need to change is instead of redirecting, you need to return some HTML that contains the image. So there is an image tag with the right attributes in there to show the image. And there is a button with the caption next that when you click on it loads a new image. So go ahead. You can pause the video and take time to work on this exercise on your own. Later on, we're gonna do it together. Okay, I hope you're done with the exercise. So let's do this now together. So as always, you need to create a new folder and start with that folder. I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna do my npm init and my npm installs. Okay, then we're gonna do express, then axios and everything. Npm install axios. There we go. Now we're gonna copy the code from the first exercise, and we're gonna proceed from there. Okay, close others. There we have. Okay, so now we have still the code from the first exercise, and we said our goal is now instead of redirecting to this image to put this image in a URL, and that's what we're gonna do first. So we're gonna take care of the button later. For now, we're just gonna put this image URL in some HTML. Okay, so let's do that. We know how to return HTML, right? So what we need to do is call result.send. And then here we can put in some HTML, right? We can just inline the HTML. So HTML, all right, head. We can add a title here, for example. Hack your future, random fox. Okay. Head, then body, then body, then HTML. This is the basic structure. Here we need an image thing, and then to set the URL for the image, we're going to use the attribute source. And then we're going to use this init feature to put in here the URL of the image. And then, yeah, we can also maybe add some styling here. For example, style is width is 75%. Then we're going to close this tag. And I think that's already enough. So we have some very short HTML that only has the image for now and the image source should be this URL. So I don't see a reason why this should not work. So let's see if I try to run it, if it really works. Okay, the server has started. Let's go to localhost 3000. Yeah, it seems to be working. There it is. We have our Fox in here. Yeah, great. That's really great. But we are missing the next button. Right. Now, any ideas how we can build the next button? So there are many different ways how to do it. Let's find a nice fox here. Yay, there it is. It's sleeping. That's so cute. Okay, slight digression there. Okay, so how do we add the next button here? Any ideas? So notice how whenever I open this, it always loads a random image because yeah, that's how we wrote the server. And one idea that I had, and it's fairly easy, is to add a button that basically just kind of reloads the page. All right, that would be an easy solution because every time the page is loaded, we get a new random image. So that's my first idea how we can do this. And again, there might be different ways of doing this, but I think that's fairly easy. Now, if you want to send a new request to the server, I think probably the easiest way to do that from HTML without any complex JavaScript or stuff like that is to use a form. Forms are kind of an older way how to build websites, but they're still supported by all HTML browsers. And what the form lets you do basically is the form can have a button, which when you click on the button, it sends a request to the server. It's very easy, and you can specify some details like what kind of request it should be and what the URL should be. So let's make a form. And for example, action gives you the URL, or sorry, I should say the path of the URL. The host is always the host that you are on right now. Then the method can be get, for example, because that's the one that we have implemented. And then inside this form, we can have a single button, which is called a submit button. That's why the type is called submit. And we're going to put a value to it. The value is the caption of the button. That's a self-closing tag. And then we can close the form as well. So this kind of making use of the point of the fact that our server already loads a random image whenever a new request comes in. So with this button, we just send a new request to the server. Let's try that and see how that works for us. Let me load this again. Okay, there is our Fox, there is our button. Okay, so if I press this button, it should load a new request. There it is. Let's see, if I open the DevTools here real quick. Let me see if I'm not covering the DevTools. Let's put the DevTools somewhere where I'm not covering them. There you go. If I look at the network thing, when you press on next, yeah, there is the request that goes out to localhost 3000. And the request method is get, and then the status code is 200. So this is our very simple server, which is calling another API to get some data, put the data in the HTML so that the user can use this API without actually realizing that they're using an API. So for the end user, I just go to localhost 3000, and then in the background, our Express server is actually talking to other APIs and getting data from them. So with that, I will close off this part. It's a pretty lengthy part. You'll practice more with APIs in the homework, and then in the next part we're gonna continue with templating engines. See you in a bit.